The lights of a packed arena suddenly dimmed, and for a split second, everything went quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. Then a voice cut through the silence, raw and trembling. Not perfect, not polished, but painfully human. And in that moment, something strange happened to the audience. Thousands of people stopped cheering and started listening like their lives depended on it, because they were not just hearing a song. They were hearing someone hold their entire life inside a single note, and that someone was Kelly Clarkson, a woman the world thought it already understood, but clearly did not. What nobody in that crowd could explain later was why it felt like that performance was not just entertainment, but a confession disguised as music. There was something heavier behind her expression that night, something unspoken that lingered between each lyric like unfinished business. And as she reached for the final note, her voice cracked just slightly, not from weakness, but from something far more complicated, something that would slowly reveal itself across the next chapters of her life. Because this was not just a performance, it was a turning point. And the mystery was simple but unsettling. How does someone who seems to have everything on paper still carry a weight that shows up every time the spotlight hits them? To understand that moment, you have to understand what the world thought they already knew about her, because for more than 2 decades, Kelly Clarkson has been packaged into a simple story. The small-town girl, the reality show winner, the pop powerhouse, the talk show host, the success story. But behind those labels, something else was always moving quietly, something far more human and far less predictable. And it is that hidden layer that begins to surface when you look at her life in reverse. Before she was filling arenas, she was a young woman standing in rooms where nobody expected her to stay long. Before she was a household name, she was someone being told no more times than she could count. And before any of it, she was just a girl in Texas learning how to survive disappointment without letting it change the sound of her voice. Because even then, something about her refused to disappear under pressure. But the question that makes her story different from so many others is not how she became famous. It is what happened after fame arrived and stopped being a dream and started becoming a burden she had to carry every single day in public. Because attention has a way of turning success into something heavier than failure ever was. And somewhere in that transformation, a different version of her life began to form. One that the audience rarely sees in full. A version shaped not just by applause, but by silence at home, by legal battles that unfolded behind closed doors, and by decisions that would slowly redefine what freedom actually means when the entire world is watching your every move. Years before that arena moment, her life was already shifting in ways most people did not fully understand. On television, she was becoming one of the most recognizable voices in the world. A breakout success story born from a competition that was never supposed to create long-term legends. That competition was American Idol, and when she won it, the industry did not just gain a new artist, it gained a new benchmark for what authenticity sounded like in a manufactured world. But success, especially sudden success, rarely arrives alone. It brings expectations. It brings pressure. And for her, it brought a life that moved faster than her ability to emotionally process it. One album turned into multiple. One hit turned into global recognition. One performance turned into an entire identity she was expected to maintain forever, even when she was changing internally in ways no one could see. And that is where the first quiet contradiction of her life begins to form. Because the more successful she became, the more her private world started to demand attention in ways that success could not solve. At the same time her public image was rising, her personal relationships were forming in the background, slowly building toward something that would later become one of the most defining emotional chapters of her life. She met people through work, through the industry, through the same spaces where career and personal life constantly overlap without clear boundaries. And over time, one connection became more serious, more grounded, and eventually more permanent, leading her into marriage with talent manager Brandon Blackstock. At first, it looked like stability. a relationship built within the same world, where both people understood the demands of fame, schedules, and public scrutiny. They built a family together, and for a while that part of her life felt like a counterbalance to everything else. But even in moments that look stable from the outside, internal pressure can build quietly, without warning signs anyone else can recognize. And that is where another open question begins to form. What happens when the same industry that creates your success also becomes part of your personal life structure, where every role overlaps and nothing is fully separate anymore? Because for her, the lines between artist, mother, partner, and public figure were never clean. They were layered on top of each other, and over time, those layers began to press against each other in ways that would eventually reshape everything. While her career continued expanding, including music, television, and eventually hosting her own long-running daytime format, The Kelly Clarkson Show, something quieter was happening behind the scenes. The rhythm of her personal life was changing. And change, especially slow change, is often only visible when you look back at it from a distance. Because no one in the moment realizes they are entering a chapter that will later be described as a turning point. It just feels like life continuing one decision at a time, until suddenly you are no longer in the same place you started. And for Kelly Clarkson, that realization would not come all at once. It would come in fragments, in conversations, in distance, in pressure, in moments that did not seem dramatic individually but together formed something irreversible. And just when it seemed like her life had reached a stable peak, the story would shift again in a way that no one watching from the outside could have predicted, because success stories rarely prepare you for the part where success itself stops being the hardest challenge. And what came next would not just test her career. It would test her identity in a way she had never experienced before, and the full weight of that shift would only become clear as everything she had built began to intersect with everything she was trying to protect. Because what happens next in her story is not a collapse, and it is not a sudden fall, but something far more complicated and far more human. It is a slow unraveling of a life that still looks successful from the outside while quietly changing shape on the inside. And for Kelly Clarkson, that shift begins in the space between public applause and private silence. At the height of her career stability, she was not stepping away from success. In fact, she was expanding it. Her voice was everywhere. Her presence on television was becoming routine for millions of viewers through The Kelly Clarkson Show, where she appeared daily as a host, performer, and conversational anchor. On the surface, it looked like balance. But behind that rhythm was a life operating on constant motion, where stillness no longer existed in the same way it once had. And that raises a question that begins to grow louder as the story unfolds. What happens when a person becomes so consistently productive that they no longer have time to feel the consequences of their own life in real time? Because for her, everything kept moving forward. Television commitments, recording sessions, public appearances, parenting responsibilities, industry obligations, and somewhere inside that constant motion, emotional clarity started to arrive in fragments instead of full moments. The turning point was not a single event. It was a buildup, a quiet accumulation of pressure inside a relationship that had once felt like alignment but slowly became something more complicated under the weight of time, responsibility, and expectation. Her marriage to talent manager Brandon Blackstock had begun in a world where professional and personal boundaries were already blurred. That overlap, which once felt like shared understanding, gradually became a source of tension that neither public success nor private effort could fully resolve. And as the years passed, the emotional distance between public perception and private reality began to widen in ways that were not immediately visible. At first, there were no dramatic signals, no single breaking point, just subtle shifts, changes in energy, changes in communication, changes in how life was being carried rather than shared. And those changes often go unnoticed until they are too large to ignore. When the separation eventually became public, It did not arrive as a surprise to those closest to the situation, but to the outside world it felt sudden. Headlines formed quickly, narratives formed faster, and as always in public life, complexity was reduced into something easier to consume. But real life does not simplify itself just because it is being watched. What followed was not just a legal process, but an emotional restructuring that unfolded over years. Decisions about family, decisions about finances, decisions about space, time, and future direction, each one carrying weight beyond what any headline could fully capture. And during this period, something important happened in her creative work. Her music began to shift tone. It was during this era that she released material that leaned more openly into emotional processing, particularly through her album Chemistry, a project shaped heavily by reflection, frustration, acceptance, and emotional clarity. But even describing it as an album is not enough. It functioned more like documentation, a way of translating internal experience into something structured enough to survive being heard by millions. And this leads to another question that sits beneath everything she created during this time. When a person turns their private emotional life into public art, does it free them, or does it freeze that moment of pain in time forever? Because every song became a snapshot, every lyric became a timestamp, and every performance became a reminder that healing, in public view, does not always move in a straight line. While her professional life remained active and highly visible, her personal life was undergoing something far less visible but far more defining. She was raising her children, navigating co-parenting realities, managing public attention, and continuing to perform and host, all while processing emotional change that had no clear timeline. And then, life introduced something that no narrative arc prepares for. A shift that was not about career or fame or structure, but about mortality itself. The passing of Brandon Blackstock after a prolonged illness changed the emotional context of everything that had come before it. Because whatever history existed between them, whatever conflict or resolution had occurred, it was no longer the defining factor. What remained was something far simpler and far heavier. The father of her children was gone. And in moments like that, all previous narratives collapse into something smaller and more immediate. Not headlines, not stories, but responsibility, memory, and the quiet weight of explaining loss to children who did not choose any of it. For a time, she stepped back from the public rhythm. Not as a statement, but as necessity. And when she returned, audiences noticed something different. Not in what she said, but in how she carried herself. There was a softness in her presence that did not need explanation. Because grief does not announce itself. It reshapes everything quietly. And this is where another layer of her story begins to surface. Because while the world often focuses on her career evolution, her real transformation during this period was internal. It was about recalibration, about deciding what matters when everything unnecessary has already been stripped away by circumstance. She did not stop working, but she did begin to prioritize differently. Her children became central in a way that is not symbolic but structural. Every decision, every schedule, every commitment filtered through a simpler question. Does this support stability, or does it add pressure? And at the same time, something else was changing. Her relationship with public identity itself. Because after decades in the spotlight, she was no longer just a performer reacting to the industry. She was someone actively shaping how she wanted to exist within it. That shift is subtle, but it is powerful. It is the difference between being carried by a career and steering it deliberately. And yet, even in this phase of clarity, one question still follows her everywhere she goes, even when it is not spoken out loud. Is there still space in her life for something personal that is not defined by history, responsibility, or public interpretation? She has never answered that question in a way that closes it. Instead, she leaves it open, sometimes with humor, sometimes with honesty, sometimes with silence. And that openness becomes its own form of narrative control, because it refuses to let speculation become conclusion. But while her personal life continues to evolve quietly, her professional world is entering yet another transformation. One that suggests she is not slowing down, but redefining the shape of her output entirely. And that is where the final chapter of the story begins to take form, because everything she has survived, built, and rebuilt is now feeding into something new, something that looks less like reinvention, and more like ownership of her own rhythm for the first time in decades. Because the next phase of her life does not arrive with a single announcement or dramatic reveal. It arrives quietly, almost like a decision made in private long before the public ever notices the consequences of it. For Kelly Clarkson, that phase begins when success stops feeling like something she is chasing and starts feeling like something she is finally allowed to shape on her own terms. For years, her career moved within systems built by other people. Labels, networks, production teams, industry structures that determine timing, image, and output. Even at the highest level of success, those systems still define the boundaries of control. But something begins to shift when she steps more firmly into ownership of her own creative direction, choosing not just what she performs, but how and when it reaches the world. And that shift is not just professional. It is psychological. Because ownership changes the emotional relationship a person has with their work. It turns obligation into intention. It turns schedule into choice. And for someone who has spent decades being moved through different phases of public expectation, that kind of control becomes more than business. It becomes identity. At the same time, her presence in television through The Kelly Clarkson Show continues to reinforce a different side of her personality. Not the performer on stage, but the conversational presence in everyday living rooms. A space where she is not performing perfection, but reacting in real time. Laughing, listening, improvising, sometimes even pausing in ways that feel unedited in an industry that rarely allows that kind of openness. And that contrast becomes important. Because the more controlled her artistic output becomes, the more natural her public personality feels. And that balance is not accidental. It reflects a deeper change in how she is choosing to exist inside fame rather than being defined by it. But even as her professional world stabilizes into something more self-directed, the emotional undercurrent of her life remains complex. The chapter of marriage, separation, and loss involving Brandon Blackstock does not disappear. It simply changes form. It becomes memory, responsibility, and reflection rather than active conflict. And that shift brings a different kind of emotional clarity, one that often only arrives after the most difficult chapters have already passed. There is a moment in many long careers where a person realizes that survival is no longer the goal. The goal becomes coherence. A sense that all the different versions of themselves still belong to the same story. And for her, that realization seems to quietly define this stage of life. She is no longer just the young winner of a televised competition. She is no longer just the chart-topping voice or the talk show host or the public figure navigating personal change under constant observation. She is all of those things at once, layered together, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in tension, but no longer separated into isolated identities. And that is what makes this chapter different from everything that came before it. Because earlier phases of her life were defined by acceleration, rapid success, rapid exposure, rapid emotional and professional shifts. But this phase is defined by selection. What to keep, what to release, what to prioritize, and what no longer needs to be carried forward. Even her relationship with love and connection reflects this shift. She does not frame it as absence. She frames it as timing, a space, as a life already full in ways that cannot be easily rearranged. And that perspective removes urgency from something that the public often tries to turn into speculation. Instead of chasing narratives about her personal life, she redirects attention back to the only thing she has ever consistently controlled: her voice, her choices, and her willingness to show up honestly even when the context around her is unpredictable. And that honesty is what continues to define her connection with audiences. Because people do not connect to her simply because she is successful. They connect because she feels consistent in her emotional presence. Whether she is performing a song about heartbreak or laughing through an unscripted television moment, there is a sense that nothing about her is entirely manufactured. And in a media environment increasingly shaped by performance layers, that authenticity becomes rare. As her Las Vegas performances continue, the energy around her live shows becomes less about nostalgia and more about endurance. Not endurance in the physical sense, but emotional endurance. The ability to revisit older material while still finding new meaning in it. The ability to stand in front of thousands of people and not perform a version of herself, but simply be herself within the structure of performance. And that is where the final illusion of her story begins to dissolve. The idea that there was ever a single version of her life that defines everything. There was no single rise, no single fall, no single comeback. Only a continuous process of adaptation. From small-town beginnings in Texas to global recognition. From televised discovery on American Idol to becoming a multi-platform entertainer. From personal relationships that shaped chapters of her emotional life to professional reinvention that reshaped how she interacts with the industry itself. Every stage builds on the last, but none of them fully replace what came before. And perhaps that is the most important truth of her entire journey. She did not become someone new each time her life changed. She became more of who she already was. And that raises one final question, not about her career, not about her fame, and not even about what comes next professionally, but something more human, something that lingers long after the final note of a performance fades into silence. What does it mean to build a life in public and still remain unbroken in private? The answer is not something the story resolves neatly, because her life is still unfolding. There is no final chapter yet, no completed arc, no endpoint where everything suddenly becomes clear in retrospect. Instead, there is only continuation. New performances, new decisions, new versions of old songs finding new meanings in different years. New moments where the audience thinks they are watching a familiar story, only to realize they are still seeing it evolve in real time. And that is why her story continues to hold attention across decades. Not because it is finished, but because it refuses to become simple. Because every time it seems like the narrative has settled into something predictable, it shifts again into something more layered, more human, and more real than the version that came before it. And somewhere in that ongoing evolution, one truth remains steady above everything else. The voice that once walked onto a stage with nothing but hope is still there. Not unchanged, but still unmistakably hers. And as long as that voice continues to evolve, the story is far from over. Because some lives are not meant to be concluded. They are meant to be witnessed as they unfold,